So many games that I want to play on the channel. I wish I had some sort of guidance to help me decide. Well, that's a start. Are you wanting to be in the video too? Are you going to help me record a video? Yeah? Yeah. Greetings fellow flatcaps and welcome to the Spectrum. Here we are, on a milestone of an episode, as this begins the 80s chapter of the book. The 80s. Great cinema and eye-straining fashion, but most importantly, gaming, which is shooting for the stars. Pac-Man releases, the Commodore reigns supreme in a console wars with the NES coming for its throne. Arcades are left behind as home computer gaming takes over in popularity, new sound cards make games sound just a little bit better, and Nintendo releases the legendary Game Boy. Having looked through the book already, I can assure you that there's going to be quite a few memorable titles coming up, including some that I've never heard of, which is the case for today's game. Since the release of Asteroids and Lunar Lander, vector-based graphics were the new trend developers were chasing, and through their efforts came the early days of 3D gaming. One of the earliest titles to popularise the 3D style was Battlezone, an arcade game which some claim to be the very first first-person tank shooter game. Players competed for a high score in a 3D arena, blasting away at enemies and surviving for as long as they could while showing off its futuristic technology. An exciting time for gaming, I'm sure. So what is Battlezone, and how did it come to be? Let's take a look. Our story first begins in 1974. Edward Rodberg, a games developer for Atari, finishes up work on baseball, then returns to Atari for more work, where he finds himself as part of a brainstorming session. What happened there? Well, I'm going to give a shout out to Arcade Attack and let the man himself tell you how Battlezone came to be. Also, I just noticed this shirt.
That was going on just as I was finishing up Battlezone, the offsite for that, not Battlezone Baseball, as I was finishing baseball. The offsite for that. So when they came back and I was ready for a new game, I was one of the first people to get a crack at that brainstorming sessions things, and there was a first-person 3D, tank game, and Atari had done a bunch of tank games that were really successful. You know, they did the original tank game, and then Tank 8, which was this giant tabletop thing where you could have up to 8 people driving tanks around and shooting them. And we had also just come up with Howard Dellman had developed the vector display. The idea of being able to do 3D, which at that time was like pipe dream, there had been talk about coming up with, a special process, creating a special processor from components to do nothing but 3D math. So that was the task set before. So there were a lot of new things that had to go on for that game to, even be possible to think about. So that's where the idea came from.
As you heard, the inspiration for Battlezone came from the 74 arcade title Tank, and the 76 title Tank 8. Tank we've already looked at in the combat video, so watch that one if you want to know more about Tank.
Boom, got him!
But Tank 8 is brand new to me, so let's take a look. It's an early days battle royale game before they became hollow, corporate and overused. There isn't much to say about this one. It plays very much like Tank. The obvious attraction came from being able to support 8 players at once with a cabinet that stuck out from anything else that you'd find in the building. You could play it alone, but no AI meant that you were just driving around in circles trying to find a way to entertain yourself, and no, shooting the unmanned tanks was not possible. It's a lonely life for that of a tank pilot. To its credit, it does have some cool features for a 70s title. Small walls could be destroyed and the wreckage of tanks could be used as cover, but you could only appreciate all of it if you had more players, and honestly, looks like a game where you would need more than 2, maybe even 3, to enjoy it for a while. You'll get more fun out of the attraction sequence, which apparently is true for Atari. I can't confirm it, but VJH claims that the attraction sequence was used as a betting game, as it used all 8 tanks and kept track of scores. Honestly, I can see the appeal of that. It does look pretty chaotic with 8 players, and I've done similar things on my streams using Smash Brothers, but I also wonder how common it was to get a full party of 8. So Battlezone was inspired by these 2 titles. However, there is a third title we're going to look at before the main event. Jumping back 1 year before Tank 8, we find Panther, another tank game with a matching concept. Created for the Plato system, Panther, named after the tank of the same name, is a first-person tank simulator that gave you the task of fighting against an enemy team in a deathmatch with an ultimate goal of destroying their base. This one also used vector graphics to create a 3D landscape. Yeah, it may be a bit choppy when turning, but when moving forward, it's very impressive to see it on tech from 1975. Sadly, it's not a game that stood the test of time. Not because it looks old, but because it has no AI. The Plato was one of the earliest computers designed to work while connected to a mainframe, allowing for features like chat rooms, email, screen sharing, and multiplayer gaming, of which Panther was designed around. We are witnessing the birth of LAN parties, which had the feature of TeamSpeak, and broadcast-style insults to the opposing team were also allowed in the game. Oh, the early days of online toxicity. It was so young and innocent back then. If you're playing on an emulator, like Tank 8, the most fun you're going to get is driving around, but at least you can actually blow up the base, so that's one point over Tank 8, I guess. Why is there a persistent theme of loneliness so far? Then according to the wiki, if you were to play it in multiplayer, you would be randomly inserted into the map, which varied in size and shape each game, then given a few seconds in camouflage to get into position. Then players would engage in tank warfare and assign themselves roles like scout, attacker, and you could also share fuel and ammo between allies, resupplying your allies like a Warzone Deliveroo driver. So why do I bring up Panther separately? Well, because some people think that it's one of the inspirations for Battlezone, but as Rotberg himself has said, he had heard of the game but never played it. And he also says that it may have inspired whoever originally suggested the idea at the brainstorming meeting where it was proposed, but I seriously doubt it. With inspirations in hand, Rotberg and his team got to work, and in November of 1980, Battlezone releases in North America, and they went whole hog on this one. Not only did they want to make the game look good, but the cabinet as well. It had a periscope-like design for players to look through, with side windows so your friends could watch. Combine that with the 2-stick tank controls, made the user feel like they were driving a real tank. Some even go as far as to say this was the first VR game people could play, but I don't think I would agree with that. VR would imply that you're given the illusion that you're in that reality, whereas this looks more like one of those cheap VR headsets that you can just slot your phone into, and you're just watching your phone with a bit of plastic on your head. But it still looks cool regardless. I would like to try the original machine one day, but I doubt that's ever going to happen. But thanks to Antstream, I can at least experience the game. Later versions of the cabinet removed the periscope fixtures, so spectators had an easier time viewing what was happening, and I don't blame them. And I don't blame them for wanting to see what's going on. It's a technological marvel for the turn of the decade. The use of 3D vector graphics and the 2D background give a very impressive illusion of depth, and makes it look like a huge expanse of a battlefield. From this view alone, you can see how impressive it looks, and to think that this was a year before this. It also liked to show off just what it could actually do. Bullets are actually modelled, an animated volcano which was made by Rotberg as an off-the-cuff idea can be seen in the background, enemies explode into bits when killed, and your visor cracks when you're killed. Some of you may ask, is it actually 3D, or is it just very convincing 2D trick of the eye? It is actually, in fact, 3D. At the time, Atari had developed what they called the Math Box, the latest in CPU technology at that date, which was designed to build 3D games. Impressive as the graphics are, they do have some flaws. Trying to judge just how far away something is from you, if it isn't already close to you, also poses some difficulty, as well as trying to determine if something is behind cover or not. The radar is hard to read because of the dot. Can you see it? No? Well, that tiny little speck right there, that dot, which is just as tiny as the amount of respect that Blizzard has for Baldur's Gate 3, that's the enemy. You can look in the direction of the dot to try and get a better idea of where it is, but it's not entirely accurate. So it's gorgeous, but what about its gameplay? It's a tough game that takes a sudden harsh spike in difficulty in just under a minute because of a few different factors. Your goal is to amass a high score in an endless battlefield with 3 starting lives and any more you may acquire while hitting milestones. The controls may be difficult for some people to grasp as they are literal tank controls. Both of the sticks up move you forward, down to go back, and then just pushing one of the sticks forward will make you turn while moving. Sounds complicated, but once you get your hands on it, it's a lot easier to handle than a Resident Evil game. Your tank is slow, but your turning is even slower, which is a real burden if you're trying to shoot an enemy to the side of you before they get sight of you and put one in your arse. Or if you're just trying to chase after them when they're trying to outmaneuver you. As you cruise through the battle zone, 3 types of enemies will appear. First up are the slow tanks. As the name implies, they're slow, stupid, and cannon fodder, but will get faster and smarter every time you kill one. Then come the super tanks. I wasn't able to make it far enough in the game for one of these to turn up, but they're the harder version of the slow tanks. And then there's the missiles. If you take too long to kill an enemy, they will fly in from above and often jump scare you as you see the last moments of your life from the corner of your eye. Oh no! You could also find a harmless UFO that you could shoot down for extra points. Enemies are very accurate in their shots and can calculate the angle they need to hit you easily. You can try and outmaneuver their shots if you listen out for their cannon, but being unable to rotate your cannon independent of your treads means that you can't keep an eye on them to get a visual clue of how close they are to you, or even if they're aiming at you. So all you can do is just cross your fingers, try to anticipate them, and hope that you react to the sound in time. What's even worse is that sometimes the game decides to be a dick and respawn you right in their firing line. But if you're lucky, this can also happen to them. Yeah, how's it feel, shithead? The hit detection is amazing, by which I mean it is both your best friend and your worst enemy. Shots will miss enemies by inches, and the same goes for you, but obviously not as often. You could try and avoid shots by taking cover, but your tank be hella thick, meaning that you may not be safe as you think you are when behind cover. Even getting into cover is tough, as you can't always tell if you're too close to something, and if you are, the game will act like a pissed off GPS telling you that you're blocked and you can't move. Then when you try to fix yourself... failure. This is even harder to pull off as the enemy gets stronger because their turning will get faster, so by the time you actually see an enemy that's just spawned, they will have already finished up lining up a 360 no-scope on you. If you can make it to cover, then you can trick the AI into leaving themselves open as they fire at you until they get point blank with the cover, then after a few seconds of thinking, realise that this isn't working, back up, reverse into the open, and then death by cheap shot. Overall, I can see why this game shot up in popularity. Its tech is way ahead of its time, the cabinet stands out from the rest, and it's mostly competent in the experience it wants to provide, bar a few flaws that can hinder your fun a little. I can only imagine how much fun this must have been when it was brand new. So how about we ask someone who was actually there when it was released? TJ, over to you.
Howdy folks, TJ here. Battlezone. You've recently seen me playing some Battlezone games, and let's chat about Battlezone a little bit, because Battlezone is one of those video games from back in the 1980s that, kind of like Pac-Man and Space Invaders and all those, was a very popular game at the video arcade in my little city in California. The name of the local arcade was called Video Ranch. And typically on a Friday night, we would... me, buddies, girlfriends, you name it, after school and you went home and did your stuff and you got in your car, went back into Main Street downtown and cruised. If you're older like me, cruising down Main Street in your fast, hot, old car, clunkety, whatever it is, was a thing. We would cruise downtown, pick up the ladies, or them picking up the men, just going out having a good time, and then we would end up at the Video Ranch playing video games. My favorite was Dig Dug. Love Dig Dug, but Battlezone was one of those games that introduced kind of a 3D, you're in it feel, and it was a phenomenal game for the time. So recently, I played, and the box looks like how I play video games. It was in some bulk purchase that I did. This is Battlezone for my Atari ST. I just recently did a video on that, enjoyed playing it, and then I started exploring. Every platform out there probably has a Battlezone or Battlezone-esque or a clone of it. On my Atari 2600, I just played one called Robot Tank. And it was very cool. I'm sure, and I'm not sure, I didn't research enough, but I'm guessing the Atari, since Atari kind of owned Battlezone or whatever, they probably have an official Battlezone version. But I came across Robot Tank, and I just played it on the 2600, and it was a lot of fun. Again, Battlezone feel. I'm in a tank shooting it. What was cool about that version of the game, though, is there was night and day. And if you get shot, you lose sight of stuff, and you can't see where you're shooting. All sorts of crazy things. The night theme was really crazy. All of a sudden, the screen went black, and I'm like, is this a bug in the game? What's going on? I couldn't see anything, but when I shot, the screen would light up a little bit, and I could see me shooting tanks. There was a clock up at the top ticking your days, so dawn, dusk, all that crap. Really fun version of the game. So I started thinking, I've got my Specky next here. I've never played Battlezone on it, and like I said, if you probably Googled every platform, there's probably a Battlezone kind of game, whether it be a clone or a knockoff, for Battlezone for other platforms. I have a Specky next down here, which is a masterful piece of art that plays all the old Specky games. And I went to World of Spectrum and typed in Battlezone, and guess what I found? An official port of Battlezone for the Specky. I thought I'd play it for you today and just see what it's like. This is the first time, so I'm going to play it also on my ultimate bastard joystick that I recently was gifted by Karsten, a friend of mine on the internet. We're going to try playing it on it. Let me push things back a little bit. I want to have...
Thanks, TJ. If you'd like to see more about Battlezone, then be sure to go say hi to TJ at some point. Even with those hindrances, it's a very impressive and entertaining piece of kit. So entertaining that rumours started to spread among playgrounds. Players started making outlandish claims, like being able to drive up and into the volcano to explore the hidden caldera. It was so impressive to players that it made a lot of money for Atari, and even attracted the attention of the military. Yeah, believe it or not, 1 month after Battlezone's release, the United States Army approached Atari and commissioned them to make a computer simulation program to train soldiers in using the Bradley tank. Some of the developers, including Rotberg, refused to work on the project because of its association with the Army. After being promised by management that he would never be asked to work on anything related to the Army again, Rotberg spent 3 months non-stop working on the project and produced a prototype of the Bradley Trainer. Only 2 were ever produced. One was sent to the Army and is now presumed lost, the other is owned by the collector, Scott Evans. While you can get it running on an emulator, I wasn't able to try it myself, but as you can see from this footage, it shares a lot of similarities with Battlezone, except now it includes helicopters. Instead of moving your whole tank, only your gun moves, and the machine guns have been added to your arsenal, and much better looking graphics have been implemented. Now you might be watching this and going, this can't be real. Well, I can assure you it is, and in 1981, it made the news.
Baseball is an old established sport that has become a big business, but there are newer games that also have become immensely popular and profitable. And one of them in particular may even be used by the Army to help in training and recruiting. Pentagon correspondent David Ensor has that story.
Battlezone. It's one of a new generation of electronic games that are taking Americans by storm, especially male Americans, who flock to arcades like this one around the country to do battle with the machines. In the games, you are fighting enemy forces, and the object is to get them before they get you. which is exactly the idea in a real war for a tank gunner, or say the gunner driver of one of the Army's new M2 infantry fighting vehicles. And that gave the Army an idea.
It'd be awfully nice to be able to go downstairs if we were both gunners and spend 30 minutes each day kind of resharpening or rehoning our skills without the problem of loading up in vehicles and driving 50 miles out to find a range where you could fire.
It would be awfully nice, and it would also save on ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. The cost of them is skyrocketing. So the Army Training Command recently asked the Atari Game Company to adapt one of their Battlezone games to have the controls, characteristics, and sounds of an infantry fighting vehicle. Be careful of that enemy tank. But wait, get the helicopter first. That's the bigger threat to you. Army officers were delighted with the machine and planned by this October to contract with a game company to build about 10 more, this time to resemble the gunner's controls on the Army's standard M60 tank.
Put them in clubs, in messes, maybe put them in break rooms, put them down in the motor pool, and find out whether or not soldiers will do this on their own and what kind of feedback we get.
The Army will then study whether the games improve the hand-eye coordination and accuracy of their gunners. If so, they may order hundreds of them and have them adapted for their purposes. And there's even talk of using electronic games as a recruiting gimmick.
You walk past one of these commercial arcades, and I think we all have walked in through a shopping mall, and you watch the volume of people, the quantity of people who are wandering in and out those doors, and they're all seized with the competitive edge of running these machines. Something's happening in there. I know that the Army would like to capitalize on that.
A capitalization that calls for an investment of only 25 cents at a time.
Join the Army today. It's just like Battlezone, only with no extra lives. With the popularity of Battlezone increasing, Atari was inspired to try and expand on the success by creating Red Baron. This 1981 arcade title used the same premise and the vector graphics technology, but made you airborne, with a few other little details to push the tech further. You could see your own rotor blades, machine gun bullets were visible, enemies were now biplanes, the UFOs became zeppelins, you have full 3D movement rather than just spinning on a flat surface in a circle, and barrel rolling when you died gave a new meaning to the term spin-off. You suck! Battlezone was an instant hit for Atari. Selling an estimated 15,000 cabinets, was ported to 5 different home computers as well as the Atari 2600, and quickly became one of Atari's most profitable games. Now, of course, with great success comes other developers and companies being inspired and producing many copycats, including Atari. As you can imagine, most of these titles are just bare basic rip-offs that tried and failed to mimic the magic and success of the original. 2 of them, however, did turn out to be pretty decently received and decent games, one of which is Atari's own 2600 title, Robot Tank, which TJ has also covered, so be sure to check him out if you want to know about that. The other is Encounter by Novagen for the Commodore 64, which I need to point out has the cheek to claim it's an original title. Now, obviously, you and I watching this video know better, but let's see how much it plays like Battles. Oh, fuck me! How am I supposed to control this? With a matching premise, your goal is to shoot down enough enemy sources and kamikaze drones. What makes it stand apart from Battlezone is its presentation and appearance. From just a glance, you can see that the graphics are sprite-based, not vector, meaning that you have a few eye-straining colours to endure, but still impressive at how they portray the 3D world. The environment is flat, except for oddly placed pillars that you can pinball your shots off to try and get some fancy shots to impress nobody but yourself. Enemies still appear one at a time, but are small in variation and are even fewer than Battlezone's catalogue. Only 2 in fact. Saucers, which act like a less capable player, moving, then pausing to shoot before moving again, with each saucer varying a little bit on its tactics. And the second enemy are announced in-game via this sound. What the fuck? Every time you hear this simple but anxiety-inducing sound, you will freak out, as this is when the kamikaze drones arrive. Spawning from the sky, moving much faster than the enemy and only slightly faster than you, they will beeline straight towards you as you spin and panic in haste to try and find them before they get to you. As you can see, the speed of your vehicle has been turned up to 11, both a gift and a curse. Yes, you can move quickly, but you still have tank controls, and you can only move quickly in 4 directions. Strafing is also not an option, so avoiding as well as landing your shots is a lot harder to do. On the plus side, going full reverse gives you a better chance of dealing with the kamikaze drones, as they have a chance to drift into your crosshairs. It doesn't always work, but luckily for us, we don't die in one hit and can take quite a few of them before game over. Once you reduce the enemy counter to 0, which can be a very tedious task, you have a limited time to enter the door to the void. If you miss it, you'll need to kill the enemies all over again. If you enter, it gets scary. Okay, there is no Mr. Popo, but there is a zooming through space section. Fuck up just once, and you're back to the start of the last level. Despite the obvious copying, efforts were made to distinguish it from Battlezone, and players did receive it well, and I can see why in this case too. It does have some fancy tech in it, and it is a well put together if flawed game that offers up some entertaining gameplay. An 8-bit version of this was released for the 8-bit family, which obviously was a downgrade, as seen in the dumber AI which made it easier to play, but still fairly impressive in what it could pull off graphically with inferior technology. Now speaking of 8-bit, 8 years later after its arcade release, Battlezone made its own 8-bit version to reach more audiences. And this port is so-so, because while there are some improvements like the radar being easier to read, it has some glaring issues too. Limitations meant that you were reduced to controlling the tank with just one stick, making the controls worse as turning and moving at the same time was no longer an option. It was also too easy to play, as the dumb as fuck enemies would spawn in, most of the time, directly in front of you, or sometimes in your crosshairs already. Gameplay wise, it does lack, but it is still impressive how they managed to emulate the 3D vector world with only 8 bits. Even the volcano is still present. You'd think that with a product as successful as Battlezone, Atari would try harder to expand on the series, right? Sequels, spin-offs, things like that? Well, that isn't the case. For 9 years, all Battlezone saw was ports to other platforms met with mixed receptions. During these 9 years, a monumental event in gaming history would happen, as Nintendo released the Game Boy, arriving in America in July 1989. Atari, seeing that times were a-changing, went, "Oh yeah? Well, we'll make our own handheld console too, and it'll be stylish, and it'll be edgy, and it'll have colour, and we'll name it after the species of a cat." So in September of 1989, Atari released the Atari Lynx. A better name than its project name, Handy. And this is where Battlezone finally got a sequel named Battlezone 2000 in 1994. The formula in appearance was the same, yet the graphics suffered a little bit. While the 3D imagery and iconic look of the game was still present, dummy thick lines meant that the details were hard to make out, which made judging distances even harder. The volcano was still present, and now a moon enjoying the bloodshed had been added as well. Gameplay wise, it does feel good to handle and play. There are a few new features like tank customization, missiles, a new enemy type, a fairly decent music score, a health bar in the form of a shield, a fuel meter, and pickups. Now it's not a bad game, it's definitely not a bad game. It certainly gets you involved, and with some of its new mechanics, it adds a lot of fun factor, and you could entertain yourself with this for a while if you treat it like a roguelike. But it isn't without its flaws. The new features make it feel a bit too easy. On my first ever attempt, I was able to get to level 10 before getting a game over. Mainly due to the high shield meter on the tank that I'd chosen, and the missile that homes in and did a ton of damage on enemies was a huge lifesaver. Pickups seem to be endless, so there's no pressure to preserve shops. The endless landscape is now confined to a, to be fair, decent size arena with barriers that stop you going out of bounds. The AI did seem to input read a few times, stopping or reversing just as you fired a leading shot. The radar does tell you where enemies are, but it isn't as accurate as past ones, meaning you could be searching for a fair amount of time as they continue to pound shots into you before you even spot them. The biggest flaw by far is, I think the game developers gave up on it, not expecting players to go further than level 4. As opposed to an endless battle, you now take on enemies in waves, each of which having an objective to fulfill. Either kill a set number of foes, get a score kill count within the time limit, or accumulate a point total. Now, accumulating a point total was the only one I was getting after wave 4, with the score amount I needed matching the wave times 1,000. Overall, not bad, but it's lacking. 2 years later, Battlezone would reappear on the 2-pack game alongside Breakout for the Game Boy, but its next installment wouldn't be until 1998. Battlezone for Windows followed by a sequel in 1999. Now the originals I weren't able to try for myself, but I was able to get the remakes on Steam, which we'll get into later. For now, let's look at the N64 title Rise of the Black Dogs to try and get some idea of how the original played. Often incorrectly claimed to be a port of the 98 PC title, Black Dogs is in fact a recreation of it, because most of the coding had to be modified to run on a console. Okay, well let's take a look at it, shall we? I have no idea what I'm doing. Did I do good here? Is that what I shoot? Oh, I found the eject button.
Die. Da, 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 da. Come sing. Ah!
My own ally just ran me over. So while not a port, it does feature most of the missions which have also been recreated almost to a T from the PC game and has a similar plot. That being that there is a war happening in space between the US and Soviet Russia as they fight for a rare resource called biometal on the moon and any other planet that they may inhabit. Booting up the game for the first time shows there are 3 modes to play. Arcade, which is reminiscent of the classic arcade game where you fight off waves of enemies. Pilot mode, which is a story mode where you take on the role of a single soldier of your chosen faction. And Commander mode, which works the same but allows you to give orders to the troops on your team at the same time. When I got into the game, oh boy howdy did I hate the controls. So to drive the tank, you used the C buttons to move and strafe, and the sticks to turn while aiming up and down, and I do not like it. It does take some real getting used to, and I just couldn't hack it. One big difference between this and the other titles is that now you can eject from your tank to run on foot to swap to an empty one. If you can find one, that is. In my experience, most of my combat was done in one tank. Then if I needed a fresh one, I ejected from the tank, couldn't find one, and then ended up back in my damaged one anyway. So I hate how it handles, but what about the game structure? Not much better either. You choose from one of 3 factions. The United States, the Soviets, and the controversial Black Dogs. Why controversial? Well, because technically speaking, Rise of the Black Dogs is a console-exclusive expansion pack, as this faction was only playable in N64, while Red Odyssey was its own PC-exclusive expansion pack, making fans on both sides of the console wars pretty pissed off. Whenever you start a mission, or whenever your objective comes up, it scrolls by so fast that you struggle to read what it says, and with no narrator you're bound to miss something. So you have to rely on objective markers to give you a vague sense of what to do. Sometimes when I was playing the game, the objectives would complete themselves while I had no input in it. The only voiceover I ever heard was at the beginning of the US campaign, giving a bit of exposition.
Sometimes it bugs me that Armstrong and Shepard get all the credit. But we all wanted to win the Cold War. And we were ready to commit our lives to getting the biometal.
Yeah, fuck you, Armstrong and Aldrin. I'm doing real work. I wasn't really keen on this. It felt very slapped together in a hurry so they could get it to consoles as soon as. And I absolutely hate the control scheme. I'm often wondering if I'm doing the right thing in the level, and I couldn't stay invested in it. Now, normally I would say that's enough for me to skip over the PC titles, but the fact that this isn't a port but a recreation doesn't mean that I can judge it fairly. And judging by players' attitudes towards this, it wasn't well received because people would rather a port than a recreation. And players were very pissed off by that, which is probably why Fuchsia entries, rather than trying to imitate something that they had done before, just stuck to their guns, with the PSP entry focused on being more of a multiplayer shooter, and the Xbox Live Arcade release saw it going back to its roots with a new lick of paint. Judging by some gameplay footage of the 98 PC game, The Black Dogs does have some similarities to it, and like I said, it would be unfair to judge the PC one solely on my experience of the N64 one. So let's get into the 2016 Redux version and see how it is in comparison. A vast improvement. It's much easier to get a grasp of because a voice actor on the radio keeps you informed of your objectives, and better tutorial missions make understanding how to play as a pilot and commander a hell of a lot easier. Now, judging Redux by itself, it's a decent game, but it does require some multitasking and working under pressure to conquer, both of which I suck at. The short version is that it reminds me quite a bit of Command & Conquer Renegade. The longer version? It does have a gameplay style that gets you involved, but it does have some problems that hinder your experience to varying degrees. The most recurring one that I bumped into was the controls. It feels so much better to handle, to an extent. Redux does allow for multiple controller types to be used, but I couldn't get them to work, so keyboard and mouse it is. Which work fine. Using WAS to move around and strafe is great, with the commander menu using numbers as shortcuts. It lets me issue orders to my underlings much easier. But the turning and aiming? Aiming is fine, up and down only to adjust your tank barrel, and it doesn't reset to a default position. When it comes to turning, it's still pretty shoddy, depending on the tank. Smaller, faster ones are fine, but when I'm playing in a bigger one, it does mean that I have to keep moving the mouse in the same direction to get even the slightest turn. I get that bigger tanks should be harder to handle because they're clunkier and slower, but could I just not hold the mouse to the right instead of a jack-off motion? The difficulty of the game is a small hill to climb for new players. In the first American missions, there is a moment where you need to save a scavenger unit from attack. In the N64 version, this was no worries. But in Redux, the scavenger was already under attack when the objective came up, and when I got there, the scavenger was nearly dead. It just assumes that you know what you're doing straight away and will just throw things at you, expecting them to just stick. It's one of those games where you can get good at it by remembering what happens when to beat the challenge, rather than learning new and improving on your current skills to overcome a challenge. Not necessarily a bad thing, some people prefer that. I'm indifferent about it, but as a whole, Redux is a different experience. I'm a little drawn to it because of the Renegade vibes that I'm getting, and I may come back to it in the future. As it is a remake, it also has mod support, which entices me even more. Wait, hang on, this is the internet. There can't be nude mods for this one, surely? No, there's not. I am genuinely surprised by that. But, playing this again, that's for another day. Let's see if Battlezone Commander, the 2018 remake of the 1999 sequel, can offer up a better experience. Honestly, better, but not much different. The tanks still operate the same, including the jack-off turning, but it's smoother to do, and even the on-foot controls have improved. I can look up and down! The plot is more developed with recurring characters, the missions are better structured but still have the problem of objectives failing or even succeeding before you even arrive, and sometimes there's a soft lock. Some of the old mechanics make a return with improvements, as well as new problems, and new toys to play with. I wanted that one, you bitch! For the most part, this one feels better to play. The tutorial plays out across a series of short story missions, slowly introducing everything in memorable chunks. You have more reasons to get out of your tank now, as you can enter buildings to use the facilities that they provide. Graphically, the game is subjective. You might like the new look, but some people say it's too dark and maybe in some cases goofy. And I can see the appeal of both styles, but the dark style does offer a suitable atmosphere for that meteor is frozen in space. How's that work? One of the biggest changes is that the plot doesn't take place during the US-Russia war anymore. Instead, you're fighting, can you guess? Aliens!
Of course!
Now, making orders is a lot easier to do now because buildings and units have been separated by a single F. Everything just feels better, even if not much has changed. Now, before we conclude, I want to say that there is one more game I want to look at. Technically, this is the newest in the series, though it's not the most recent game, but it's the most recent game which isn't a remake. Normally, under the circumstances I would leave this game out, but I've got a new toy I need to try. Battlezone is a VR compatible entry from 2017, and it's a good time. If you can get it to work. Eventually I did, but before that I had to listen to the plot from the floor. The abbreviated version is that an AI has taken control of Earth and you need to fight your way to the volcano where the AI is stationed and defeat it. After a bit of fidgeting, I was able to get into my big boy seat, customize my tank, and get into the Battlezone. What threw me off straight away was that this is a VR game that doesn't use the motion controls, relying on mouse and keyboard instead. As is before, WASD does the movement, mouse does the aim, and turning. You could use a controller if you want to, but even trying to assign the buttons wasn't working very well. As someone who grew up with consoles, I did have some difficulty handling the tank, but even with this handicap, I was still able to effectively play. Each mission is a square on the map. You need to blast your way to the volcano, on the way completing missions, buying upgrades, collecting new weapons, and destroying shield generators to make the final encounter easier. All the while, the enemy growing in strength the longer you take. Once you get to the game, you'll be greeted with Tron-inspired graphics with enemies in red and allies in blue. And they look great. The perspective is convincing. I can actually make out details in the distance and actually pull off some decent long distance shots. All of the info you need to maintain your tank is all around you and easy to find. You can even see your weapons arming themselves from your cockpit. Ha! I said pit. You can hold up to 5 weapons and 1 super weapon that you can buy and sell at shops, or use your credits to purchase upgrades to your tank, which you're going to need, as if the enemy gets too strong, they will send a nemesis tank after you, which is one of the most powerful enemies in the game. On the map you'll find the odd square, which is a shop or even an event that could result in good or bad fortune, but primarily, missions make up the map. Each mission will vary in objective, and unlike the Lynx game, the developers did not give up after mission 4. They can range from simple objectives like defeat the waves of enemies or exterminate X amount of enemies, while others can include destroying, capturing and or defending structures. The level design is very well done. Never while playing did I think, oh, I recognise this reused asset. Seed generation means that you won't play the same campaign twice unless you make it so, and the levels along with their objectives are varied enough to not make the battle arenas seem familiar too quick. Then once you complete or fail the game, you can replay it with any unlocked weapons and tanks you have, roguelike style. It's well executed simple fun and can be played in co-op with your friends. It's quite impressive how they managed to update the game but keep the charm of the original and keep it entertaining. My only criticism is that I still have to turn any tank and would prefer motion controls to feel more, no pun intended, hands-on. Even so, the controls it does have work, and I still could operate my tank even if I struggled to find certain buttons, made even harder by the fact that I was raised on consoles and I partially blind myself to play. I wouldn't mind trying this with some other players. Community stream game maybe? Oh, Battlezone. Did I like it? Well, it is very impressive to look at, especially if you consider the tech available at the time. The cabinet periscope idea was unique and it is competent to play. However, I don't think I could stay with it for too long. It just doesn't grip me as much as other titles have, like Space Invaders, and it gets repetitive pretty quick and the awkward handling doesn't help either. Now you might say, you could say the same thing about Space Invaders, and I would agree, but I think in the case of Space Invaders, the difficulty climbs quicker, which keeps me involved, as well as the controls being easier to pick up. Even so, I can appreciate Battlezone for what it is, and I'm not saying it's a bad game, far from it. It's just not for me. So for those reasons, Battlezone goes into no. What would I recommend instead? Honestly, the 2017 title, which just feels like an update of the original. What about you though? Do you like it? Do you have fond memories of it? Did you ever get to try the Periscope arcade machine? Do you think a pug could play it? As always, your thoughts are welcome down below. As you type them out, I thank you for watching, and remember, you're always welcome at the Spectrum.